Hi, and warmly welcome to today's discussion, Ecological Crisis and Global Justice. My name is Helena Simic, and I'm the project manager in Kalevi Sorsa Foundation. We are a social democratic think tank, and our objective is to promote public debate on equality and democracy. But then a bit about today's agenda. I think we can all agree that ecological crisis is without a doubt one of the greatest challenges of our time. We need global solutions and we need them fast. As Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has repeatedly stated, we are running out of time. Today we will discuss some possible ways to achieve this and keeping in mind simultaneously how we could increase global justice. And then a bit about the agenda. We will first have our speakers speak individually, and then after that we will have them here on stage and you will be able to ask them some questions. But without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our keynote speaker, Helena Gualinga. She's a well-known indigenous justice and human rights defender, and it's our absolute pleasure having her here in Finland with us today. Helena has for years advocated for the protection of Amazon rainforest and indigenous people's rights. She is from the Kichwa community of Sarayaku, and they have been for years fighting big oil companies. Helena is also Finnish-Swedish, and she has graduated from Cathedral School in Turku in 2021. But yeah, so Helena, I will give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. My name is Helena Gualinga, and I usually say I come from the Ecuadorian Amazon, but I come from the Ecuadorian Amazon and Finland. My dad is Finland-Swedish, from the Helsinki area actually, but grew up in Stockholm, which is why I mostly speak Swedish, so jag pratar svenska. But my mom is from an indigenous community in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And I split my time between the Amazon rainforests from my community and this country for a very, very long time until I decided to go back there, and nowadays I spend most of my time living in the rainforest with my family and my community. My community is called Sarayaku. It's a very remote place, pristine rainforests, clean rivers. We still live in our traditional huts by fishing, hunting, harvesting, and it's a very traditional lifestyle. The way that my grandmother grew up is very similar to the way the children are growing up today, except for Wi-Fi though. And when in 2002, the year that I was born, a lot of turbulence and conflict began for my family. And yes, some of that was me, but not all of it. But unfortunately, an oil company tried to enter our community, and that's really what has shaped my entire life, has shaped who I am today, and the things that I saw during those years is what has brought me to do the work that I do today. And so in 2002, when they tried to enter, a lot of conflict, a lot of threats, a lot of violence began in my community, because not only was it the oil company, but it was backed up both by the government and the military. So they had to organize strategies to protect our community from the military forces, to protect it from what they were saying about our community, because not only was it the physical threats, but it was also defamation. They would call my family and my community terrorists, or that they were guerrillas, or say that we were armed. And I would read these things sometimes when I got a hold of a newspaper and be like what are they talking about? I'd never seen anything, any arms or anything that was violent in the community. And as time went by, I when I was around school age, I moved here to Finland because of school. education. There wasn't good access to education there back then, and there isn't today either. So my parents decided to move here for the purpose of my education, and I was able to go to school here. But the Finnish school system was super flexible with me. I don't know if it's actually like that or if I was the exception, but I was able to spend sometimes even 6 months in the rainforest and the rest here, because they chose to trust me that I would do schoolwork while I was there. And they also recognized that the teachings that I was getting by being away, by living in the rainforest, was equally as good or even sometimes even better than what I would get from being in a classroom. And I did that until the age of 15. And that entire context, that entire dynamic really shaped my perspective on the relationship that the global North has with the global South, and what my unique role could be in all of this. Because when I was here and when I was in the classroom and when I was here, I would feel so powerless that these horrible things were happening to my family and to the people that I knew and to indigenous people in general, and that no one was talking about it. We couldn't read about it in media as we do today about the Amazon rainforest. We couldn't read about the atrocities that happen against indigenous people, not what was happening at that time, but even the history of violence towards indigenous people since the beginning of colonization. There was nothing to read about. And why wasn't that a discussion? So I thought, okay, well, that's where I can start at least. I can start to stir that conversation. I did so with my friends in school, by talking to my teachers. And my friends always remember me as that one who never stopped talking about the rainforest. And I still am that person today, the one that never stops talking about the rainforest. But it really, I mean, as I grew older, I realized that there was much more I can do than just talk about it. And just do the advocacy work, which is extremely important. And I started off really young. So I have a few years of experience in that now, but it's I really saw a need for me to be involved on the ground with my community. And after graduating high school, that's exactly what I did. So I moved back to my community to be able to be directly engaged with the work that was carried out on the ground. And I always wondered, what was it that made my community so unique that we were able to win this important court case against the Ecuadorian government? Because after 10 years after that the court case, or that the companies entered our community, my community was able to win this important court case that set a legal precedent for the entire region, for entire Latin America and for Ecuador. So I really started to talk to people. What was it that made it so successful? And one thing that I kept hearing from especially one of my uncles who was the president during that time was that he said, because it was peaceful. You never respond to violence with more violence. And I think that is so important today, especially as we're trying to solve all these problems and there's so much violence happening around the world. And to hear someone who went through so much repression, who was tortured at one point in his life, to hear him say that the main reason why they won, the biggest power in the country, was because it was peaceful resistance, I think really says something about the way that how our community identifies and who we are as people. But they also used additional strategies, and one of them was communication. And I think that this generation, my generation, has really revolutionized the way that we communicate things. But so did the previous generation, even though they didn't have access to social media, at least in our case. Because even though they, every day almost on the news or on television, we would hear bad things about indigenous people in my country before. Today, that is not the case. But today, we are able to lead that narrative of who we are. We are able to tell our own story. And I often say that it's the first time in 500 years that you're actually hearing our story from our perspective. We are the ones telling our story today. Because even if you read about what happened 500 years ago when Columbus arrived to America, it was all written by Englishmen or the Spaniards. And the same goes for Latin America. It was all written by other people. It was never told from our perspective. And now there's a young generation of young indigenous people that are really setting the new narrative of how we actually want to be represented, of how we actually want to be seen, and how we want to tell our story. And one of those things that also made me really, really sad when I was younger was that not only was there violence towards indigenous people, but there was also invisibilization. We weren't seen, we weren't recognized, and people wouldn't connect the dots between indigenous people and, for example, the protection of the rainforest. And that was so obvious to me my entire life, because everywhere there was indigenous people that I would go visit, there would be rainforests. And every time we went outside, there would not be rainforests when we went into the cities, for example. And I realized that we had a huge role to play as protectors. And now you can read about it in The Guardian, you can read about it in the news, you can look at statistics, but that wasn't a narrative that was set out there before. And so it's making the link between indigenous people and making sure that indigenous people are the custodians that have the rights of these territories is actually the most efficient way of protecting not just the rainforest, but all ecosystems. It's an efficient tool to give indigenous people's rights. And that is really what I want to insert to those conversations, that where I now sit in when I'm talking to decision makers, when I'm sitting face to face with my own government. That is what I want to make sure that they know. Because we are making a big mistake if we think that we will protect the ecosystems such as the rainforest if we create more national parks, if we create more protected areas, because we can see that actually hasn't worked before. In the past, across the globe, that has not been an efficient way of protecting any kind of forest or natural place. What has been effective is giving indigenous people's rights. And that is a global conversation that everyone needs to be having. And even here in Finland, you have the Sami people. And I have met a lot of Samis in my life. I visited them in the north, and I think something that really that I see in all indigenous people is that we always stand in solidarity with each other. Either if it's North America, South America, if it's Northern Europe, there's always solidarity whenever we are struggling with the threats of extractivism and so on. So I've learned a lot from hearing the stories of the Sami people as well. And I see that it's been really, really easy for the North to point fingers, to say Bolsonaro is the bad guy, the South is the bad guy, but the same thing has been happening in the north of Europe for a very, very long time. And again, the same thing that happened to us, which was that we were completely invisibilized, is happening here in Finland too. That the Sami people are also being invisibilized as a people, as guardians of these lands. And if we don't correct those, we are only digging a bigger and bigger hole for ourselves when it comes to the protection of different ecosystems. In my community, we have something that is called the living forest. It's called, in my language, called kausaksacha. It's a teaching that we grow up with from a very early age. And when we're younger, it's just taught to us in our daily lives. The mountains, the rivers, they're all living beings, which is why we respect it as such, as I respect you, because you're all humans, we're equals. I also respect nature as an equal. It's not a resource, we call it a good of life, and it's not something where we can just go and take. It's a relationship. And this teaching is what I think has been the fundamental part of why we still today protect 1,400 hectares of pristine rainforest in my community. It is the fundamental part of our values, of our ways of being, of our ways of living. And that is the shift in mindset that I want to see in the world. It is realizing that we will not get anywhere if we don't shift our mindset and our relationship to the natural world. Because we can be talking about these green transitions and how we're going to revolutionize the energy systems and so on, but aren't we then only replacing one extractive system with another? And we've actually not had a shift in our sets of values, in our sets of mindset. And that is a reflection that I want to leave with you today, and I'm looking forward to have the rest of the conversation later. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena. I think you gave us a lot to think about. Our next speaker is Tytti Tuppurainen. She is Marin's Government Minister for European Affairs and Ownership Steering. She has been a member of the Finnish Parliament since 2011. And today she will talk about global justice from the perspective of the EU. You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Good to see so many people here interested in global justice. I must say I was very impressed to listen to Helena's speech. Thank you very much. Folks, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I was asked 3 questions for this lecture that you wanted me to answer. The first question was, how does the EU promote global justice? Second one was, what are the EU's success stories and what can we do better? And the third one was, what are future prospects and what needs to be changed? These are so very good questions, and I will use them as a starting point to share my thoughts and my comments, which we will then deliberate together. To start from the beginning, or in this case from the first question, everything to do with the EU's role in promoting global justice comes down to values. The European Union is not anything like a value-neutral community. The member states, they might have different legal cultures, but in some matters, they do not have freedom of choice. I'd like to say this very clearly. Democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, they are not optional or some kind of moral ideas. They are enshrined in an Article 2 of the treaty, immediately after the article which is establishing the Union. Our common values, they form the legal basis for the EU. We conclude agreements and engage in trade based on these values. They are our tools for building a more humane, more climate-friendly, just world. The realization of global justice requires global commitment to common values. And I'd also like to say this very clearly. These EU common values, they are universal values. They have been adopted in the United Nations Declaration and in treaties concluded within the United Nations framework. They are not any Western domain, but universal. The EU's development policy aims at a stable and safe world without poverty. This is not a pipe dream. It is part of the EU's common foreign and security policy. Finland and the EU share very similar goals in their development policy. We want to promote human rights, democracy, and good governance. We want to support fragile states. Just 100 years ago, Finland belonged to this group of states. Now it's our time to support others. Europe is expected to be a global leader in climate work. We must be at the front line. We must show that a climate-friendly world is possible. It is not just possible, but also good for both people and the economy. In recent years, the EU has sharpened its climate policy. The EU is committed to achieving climate neutrality by 2050, and this understanding was reached during Finland's presidency in 2019. Finland is also committed to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 by 55% of the 99 level to 2030. It was not an easy task to reach these understandings, but it's simply necessary. Without these deadlines, our climate actions would miss their target. The EU's climate policies, they go beyond just one continent. When we set standards, big businesses worldwide, they need to take them into account in their actions. We can see this if we take an example with privacy policy. The EU has taken a stand for better individual rights online, and these big online companies, they now need to listen to the European Union. The EU has economic power, which it can and which it should use to be a global leader in climate work and sustainable economic policies. We have the sort of regulatory power that we can and we must use to promote equality, protect minorities, and safeguard our nature. For example, when drafting free trade treaties, they should be viewed through a lens of sustainability. Finland has long striven to promote gender perspective in climate work. The Paris Climate Agreement also takes gender equality into account. In this way, the climate issue becomes intertwined with issues of women's rights. It is important that women in all societies can actively participate in decision-making, draft laws, and influence the civil society. Respect for human rights is a key element of the EU's relations with non-EU countries and international institutions. The EU actively promotes human rights and democracy globally, guided by the EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy for 2020-2024. Furthermore, all international agreements concluded by the Union must comply with the human rights defined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. So there's a legal basis for all we do. As Helena said, it is definitely important to pay particular attention to indigenous people's rights. The EU is committed to promoting the participation of leaders of indigenous communities and the defenders of their human rights in development processes and the key global decision-making fora. The EU also seeks to make the rules on responsible business conduct more effective in order to promote sustainable and responsible corporate behavior, including the lands of indigenous peoples. In the European context, Finland is actually in a privileged position. Our territory includes a part of the homeland of the Sami, the only indigenous people in the EU. I'm pleased to say that in my northern Finnish hometown, city of Oulu, we play an important role in preserving the Sami culture. It is the University of Oulu which teaches and conducts research on the Northern Sami, Inari Sami, and Skolt Sami languages. And last March, before the European Council meeting, I had the pleasure to attend the summit of European indigenous Sami people as part of Prime Minister Sanna Marin's delegation. The summit was organized by the Finnish Sami Parliament and the Finnish presidency of the Barents Euro-Arctic Council in cooperation with the European Parliament. It was an unforgettable occasion. Now, dear friends, the second question you asked was, what are the EU success stories and what can we do better? I will start with the matter that has elements of both, and it is Ukraine. Right now, this is the issue on top of our agenda. We must do everything we can to support Ukraine in winning the war of aggression waged by Russia. Russia's illegal war is a serious and horrible reminder that a multilateral, rules-based world can be challenged and is challenged at the time. The EU has been strong and united. Yes, at the end we have been united in its actions against Russia. 10 packages of sanctions have already been negotiated. We have supported Ukraine with humanitarian aid, weapons and other defense material, and we have welcomed millions of Ukrainian refugees. All this work has been based on a common understanding. Ukraine's cause is our cause. The EU also have granted the candidate country status to both Ukraine and Moldova and has recognized the membership perspective of Georgia. EU solidarity lanes have facilitated food exports from Ukraine via land routes and EU ports. The war in Ukraine is having a devastating effect of Ukrainians, but there's also an international dimension. Global food security is at risk because of Russia's unlawful actions. That's why the EU's actions in that matter are urgent. Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine is a global question, and we need to see it as such. Just a few decades ago, democracy was considered the only sustainable model for a political system. There were authoritarian systems, but they were also influenced by the attractiveness of democracy. Today, the alternatives to the rules-based world are being offered openly and shamelessly. But an increase in authoritarianism, nationalism, and superpower politics is not something like a natural law, something inevitable. We can promote democracy, peace, and stability while countering their opponents. We must step up our work for the rule of law and rules-based world in international politics. The forces that destabilize them must not be allowed to gain a foothold in Finland, Europe, and all over the world. We must understand that the virtues of liberal democracy are political imperatives. It is these liberal values and virtues that Ukrainians are bravely defending. These virtues need to be defended by each and every one of us. Which brings me to my second point, the rule of law. The principle of the rule of law is one of the EU's key values. The rule of law prevents abuse and arbitrariness and safeguards the equality of all people before law. In countries governed by the rule of law, the law is followed, and for example, nature conservation measures and environmental obligations, they are binding, not optional positions that can be swayed by bribes. The rule of law means responsibility, but above all, it means trust. In a country governed by the rule of law, companies can operate with confidence and without fear of becoming political pawns. This is about mutual trust and a force that holds the EU together. Our union's credibility at the global arena depends on it. Unfortunately, we can see now that the rules-based world is being challenged. The erosion of the rule of law is evident, and the EU must stay vigilant to prevent it from happening. The good news is that there are ways to promote and support the rule of law. Firstly, we have the Article 7 hearings based on treaties. Next week, the General Affairs Council of Ministers will discuss the rule of law situation in Poland and in Hungary. These hearings are not taken lightly. They are frank and serious discussions. Secondly, we have the so-called annual rule of law dialogues in the Council of Ministers, where we go through the development in every EU member state, one by one. This dialogue gives a good overall view on the rule of law situation in the EU and makes it possible to notice early warning signs as well. And like said, this process involves every European Union member state. For instance, I had the possibility to tell my colleagues about Finland's situation last March. Thirdly, since the beginning of 2021, the EU budget has been protected against breaches of rule of law that affect the risk of affecting the EU's financial interests. Creating this new rule of law conditionality mechanism and regulation was a key priority for Finland's EU presidency, and it is a vital addition to the rule of law toolbox. With this new conditionality, the EU can take measures to save our common budget and, for example, suspend payments to a country violating the principles of the rule of law. And this has now been implemented for the first time in the case of Hungary, and 6.3 billion euros have been frozen because of the breaches in the rule of law in the country. All three of these instruments are important when it comes to safeguarding the rule of law. And all these instruments are being used to protect the EU and the rule-based world. Dear friends, now we come to the third and the final question. What are the future prospects and what needs to be changed? One thing is certain, we must remain our unwavering support for Ukraine. Also, fragile democracies need our support for now more than ever. There's an ongoing trend where authoritarian regimes are trying to gain a foothold and increase their influence in the so-called global south, including Africa. Finland and the EU must remain vigilant in the face of this development. We must offer developing countries the kind of cooperation and partnership that is based on mutual trust and respect, democratic values, and the rule of law. I call for a genuine desire for cooperation and willingness to meet our partners on an equal footing. So what needs to be changed? One clear need involves the EU's possibilities to be an active global influencer and political superpower for good. The past few years have shown us that we need better practices in our decision-making in the EU's foreign and security policy and within the United Nations framework. We need urgently to take qualified majority voting into careful consideration and start to implement it. Finland supports expanding the possibilities of qualified majority voting in the Council. The EU cannot be held hostage by a unanimity voting in times like these. We have formed a like-minded coalition who support this issue, and next week on Monday, before the General Affairs Council, I will attend a dinner discussion hosted by Germany and France, and we will tackle this very issue together, and also other questions regarding the future of the EU. Now, dear friends, Finland's Prime Minister Sanna Marin, she recently gave a very powerful speech at the New York University graduation ceremony at Yankee Stadium in New York. She reminded us that whether we are talking about Russia's brutal war in Ukraine or the battle to save our one-of-a-kind planet, we are also talking about our common basic values. And when it comes down to these basic values, there is no middle ground. I agree with Marin. The EU can change the world. It can change things for the better. The EU must defend its common treaty-based values, the rights of women and girls, indigenous peoples and minorities depend on the influence and strength of the EU around the world. There will unfortunately always be forces that want to turn back the clock, but together we must work to achieve an EU that is the world's most competitive, socially inclusive and carbon neutral economy. An EU that radiates well-being and stability around it. And this kind of EU will provide the best possible support for global human rights, biodiversity, and the rules-based multilateral world. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Minister, for your insights and also reminding us about the importance of democracy and the rule of law. Then our last speaker is Mai Kivelä. She is a member of the Parliament of the Left Alliance, and Mai has also a diverse background in activism herself. She will be speaking about global justice from the perspective of Finland. You're welcome, Mai.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for this important topic for Kalevi Sorsa Säätiö. And I also want to thank Helena and Tytti for their important remarks previously. And as per my own topic, global environmental justice and Finland, the first point I want to highlight is about the sustainability of our own lifestyle. I think that to pursue environmental justice globally, our own society must transform into a planetary sustainable society as soon as possible. And the latest by 2035, which is the carbon neutrality year target written into our new Climate Act, which we did with the previous parliament. And of course, the planetary boundaries are a lot more than tackling just the climate crisis. They include biodiversity, water usage, and other natural resources and their sustainable use. Nevertheless, my point is that to be able to work for global justice, Finland must work on itself the hardest. We can do it as a society, and we must do it. No other path is justified and would also be hypocritical. It's not enough to invest in climate projects elsewhere if our own shared lifestyle is the root of the sustainability crisis. Overconsumption of basically everything, from energy to nature to finite resources like minerals and land. If we look at our official sustainable development goals of Finland, Finland's own challenges are specifically about or around environmental sustainability. This should tell us that we are not in a position to place guilt or blame on other poorer societies for their emissions and environmental harm they might produce, as we as so-called advanced and industrial society, we have not been able to build our own prosperity sustainably. And now we are in a big hurry to rebuild our society into an ecologically sustainable one. So point number one, our society and lifestyle here in Finland is either increasing the global crisis or one which is doing its own part in solving them. I think the answer is clear. We must change. And the second point is about how that change that is mandatory, how it's done. What my party, the Left Alliance, is demanding is that we carry out this transition in a just way. Without social justice, we don't believe it's possible to reach ecological justice and ecological sustainability. Inequality and poverty must shrink, and people must have livelihoods also in the future, as well as a part of the project of the green and just transition. We believe that the transition itself brings a lot of new kind of work, reparatory work, like this ennallistamisasetus, this, I don't know the English word. Yes, when we, for example, repair our broken ecosystems or erect windmills and teach ourselves to a new flexible and smart energy system and how to manage it. But this transition also must include cultural change, like Helena said, fixing our mindsets. Without that side of the transition, it's not possible to have a sustainable and true transition. And another example of how Finland itself must do better is our forest industry. Helena was talking about rainforest, and we have a forest activism here in Finland also. The current mode of Finnish forest industry is a threat to our own carbon sink and has endangered too many of our own native forest species and habitats. And this also, of course, has a global dimension as well. Finnish pulp companies are currently being accused of neocolonialism in Uruguay and in Argentina, where it's quite clear that the Finnish company called UPM is, regardless of the local water scarcity, taken for granted its right to use local water resources for its own benefit and revenue creation. And another point I want to raise is about the division between the so-called global south and global north. Indigenous peoples are included in the definition of global south, and indigenous land is often grabbed, confiscated to the usage and resource production of the colonizing land. Finland is actually not free from this question. It's high time to admit that Lapland is historically colonized Sami land. This has a direct link to just transition. Throughout the Nordics, the Sami land is being used in the green transition as spare land for placing windmills and mining industry. Wind power and minerals for batteries are both necessary in the transition. But if we are serious with global environmental justice, it should be obvious that we ask permission from the Sami people for those activities in their areas, regardless of what the legal technicality or legal ownership relation is. That is to say, the Sami land rights must be recognized and enforced, even if it means placing the windmills elsewhere. Sami land is not a spare land, free to be grabbed. With mining, the question is even more difficult, as the minerals might well be geographically placed where they are. Similarly, it is not right to assume that those minerals can be mined up if it means destroying the Sami way of life. It is time to admit our blind spot with the treatment of the Sami, and time to learn from our previously committed injustices and not to repeat them. I would like to believe that it's possible to carry out the just transition and start respecting indigenous rights. One example of this is the Sami Climate Council that we established in the last term and that has just begun its operation this spring in Finland. It was also written into the law, part of the new Climate Act. And time will, of course, tell, can it achieve its potential in ensuring climate justice in relation to the Sami in Finland. And finally, I want to raise a point about cross-sectionality of development policy, the coherence of our development policy. It does not make sense to fund sustainable development with one hand and with the other hand carry out unfair trade or industrial policy or security policy, which in fact draws more resources from the global south multiple times the amount that is directed here through development aid. So the trade is very important, and this also was remarked in the previous speech. At the same time, the current way of carrying out development cooperation is being criticized within the sector. For example, it's paternalistic or racially problematic practices. And the question is how to reform development cooperation in a way that makes it truly equal and relevant again, and how to reform the global economy so that it would not deform and ruin the achievements and goals of development policy. Well, the most obvious next occasion to do that would be here in Finland, would be at the ongoing governmental forming negotiations. However, I fear that it's too easy to cut from the development aid in the pressure of the general budget cuts. Development policy needs its defenders, who should also be its biggest and most motivated reformers at the same time. To sum up, the only way to have a just future is to work for an environmentally sustainable world and to work in a way that is guided by true solidarity. There's no sustainability without equality and vice versa. Finland has a lot where we need to do better when it comes to global justice and real sustainability. But we can do better and we must do better. I think there is no other option than to try and to do our best. Thank you.
Thank you, Mai. I would now ask all of our speakers to join me here on the stage. Yes, nämä mikit on päällä. Nyt se on päällä. The mics are on. Perfect. I think we can do so that I can start with a question and then we can proceed to the audience. My first question would be aimed mostly at Helena. Listening to the measures taken by the EU and Finland, what is your opinion? Are they enough, or is there something crucial we are missing from your perspective and from the perspective of the North?
I think there's always...
It should be. No.
There we go. Hello. It's always, of course, possible to do more. I think one really good thing that came out of the EU this year was the global deforestation law. And from our perspective, from our side, we were really pushing for that human rights would be included. Because that is a crucial part, what you were talking about, in reaching global justice. And I think the European Union still has a far way to go when it comes to recognizing the rights of indigenous people here, but also looking at, or I guess, in a way, manage the impact that, for example, European companies, European activity is so far has, what the kind of impact is outside of the European Union. I think there's still a lot to do. I think there's a long way to go still. But also, I think something that no one really wants to talk about, which always is the elephant in the room, is what the European Union, not the European Union, but what Europe caused in other countries. And I think the recognition of what colonization caused in other countries is the topic no one really wants to talk about. For some reason, that makes everyone really, really uncomfortable. And I think the reason why it makes everyone really, really uncomfortable is because once you recognize it, you actually need to take responsibility. And that they don't want to do. And that's why it's so uncomfortable when we speak about it. But it's actually not that uncomfortable. If you do wrong, you should rate it. And we often talk about, you mentioned it, that, there are countries in the South that are not, meeting the targets, that are not sticking to the measures that they should be sticking to. But a lot of these countries are conditioned to not to do it. And they've been conditioned for it because of the history of colonization and violence that came from this part of the world. So I think we really need to start digging deeper than kind of these measures that are quite not. I'm not saying they're superficial, but they're very specific. It's case specific, targeted, and I think we can do much better and go much deeper than that.
Thank you, Helena. Do you have comments maybe on? Do you agree?
Well, I'd like to thank Helena for pointing out to the Deforestation Act legislated by the EU. That's a very good example about how EU can regulate in a way that has an effect both domestically and internationally. I know we Finns had some problems with the regulation, but at the end I think everybody understood that it's a good piece of legislation and it can help preserve the rainforests and prevent illegal logging and also help to understand the value of nature. I really much like what you said in your introduction, that you call the forest the good of life. The nature is good of life. I like that. And about the colonial past of the West, it's true that we bear a lot of responsibility and we need to meet these problems and try to tackle these. And actually, the only way to do that is to have international arena where you can have a fair and honest debate about these issues. And I think the world is now at a watershed. Whether we go down to the path where authoritarianism grows and there is no international arena where we can discuss these obstacles and overcome them, or we choose to protect and promote our multilateralism, the system of international cooperation where we can meet regularly at the United Nations framework and create also new organizations if needed. I think we should all join our forces to protect democracy and the rules-based multilateral world. It is in danger.
Yeah, I also agree, and that's why I wanted to highlight the fact that you have to look yourself first when you think about the global responsibility. What are you doing? What are your impact on the as a individual, meaning as a country or as a international body? But I also think that it's a little bit embedded in our systems of addressing these issues. For example, like our climate work, when we are looking our climate targets and how we are calculating our are we carbon neutral or not, we are often criticizing the fact that we are, for example, here in Finland, we are only calculating the emissions that is created inside the Finnish borders, but that actually leaves out like half of the emissions we are responsible, because it doesn't include the emissions from our consumption. So should they be actually calculated as our responsibility, or should it be the Chinese emissions? So I think your remark is also like inside in so many of our systems, that how we see that when we try to do something, that are we actually really looking the whole picture, or are we just still having this too narrow mindset?
And I can add something to that real quickly. I also think that in general, I think countries where there are more emissions that bear huge responsibility for this crisis, we've kind of made up these very, very clever calculations, as you were saying, of how the carbon emissions are calculated. But also the entire carbon market and all these justifications and compensation mechanisms that science until today has proven that it's not and at all as efficient as they claim it to be. It's not even efficient, actually. And unfortunately, countries in the European Union, Finland, Norway, Sweden, they're still very participant in these kinds of mechanisms. And honestly just a waste of resources. Instead of giving the resources to where the solutions actually could come out of, where the solutions actually are, or to the people who really, really need the resources to be able to face the climate crisis because it's already too present in their daily lives. We're putting in resources into clever calculations and clever kind of like someone came up that this is how we trick the people, and they really did, So that is a huge issue. I think that we've kind of all been tricked into believing that these amazing calculations somehow are going to save us too.
One example how we prevent this sort of outsourcing of our climate responsibility is the so-called CBAM. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's the Carbon Border Management Mechanism, which means that if you import products into the EU which are produced with more carbon emissions than the products inside of the EU, then you have to pay a price for that. So we are cutting our emissions inside the EU, for instance, in steel production and in cement production and in some fertilizers, and this new CBAM regulation tries to make a worldwide effect so that other producers as well should have to move towards carbon neutral production. I think that's a good example because it can bring a win-win outcome. On one hand, we do sort of force the outside countries to change their production, otherwise they would have to pay for the imports to the EU. And on the other hand, the EU also gains new own resources because the money that comes out of this CBAM regulation, it is collected to a new fund in order to create an own resource for the EU, where we then can finance, for example, just transition that we've also talked about, that the green transition has to be just one. So I think we have also reason to be somewhat optimistic. Yes, it's time to be very, very concerned, but we have means to tackle this if there's enough political will. We have to have the political will to save the planet and make the development sustainable.
Yes. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, and like if we look at the last UN climate summit in Egypt, one of the biggest discussion there was this loss and damage fund, and it usually, or it very easily comes down to the who is paying and how much different countries are willing to pay. But what I wanted to highlight in my first speech was that even though we would like triple the funds or the tenfold put more money into our climate funds, it's still like peanuts compared to the trade flows. And that's why we can't leave out the trade deals and all these issues, like where we can really take the big money flows and see where they go.
Yeah. And I completely agree with you. I think, especially in Ecuador specifically, with the last government has been signing kind of a huge amount of trade deals. And what many times these trade deals leave out is indigenous people's rights. So there might be a trade deal that is good for the country, but really, really bad for indigenous people because it allows a bunch of extractivism and companies entering our territories despite of the threats of human rights violations and so on. And you also mentioned the climate negotiations in Sharm in Egypt. I was there earlier this year, and the loss and damage fund was something that we were really hoping for that to happen. A lot of my friends have been huge advocates for it for many, many years. But if you actually think about it, who proposed this and when was it proposed? It wasn't something that happened this year. It's been the countries that mostly are affected by climate change have been advocating for it for over 30 years? Yeah, for over 30 years. It took 30 years to establish a loss and damage fund. Imagine that climate politics takes so much time. And what you said, there has not been a political will so far until today, when really people, like society has been getting more and more engaged in kind of advocating for these things, which really, really has put pressure on negotiators and so on. I think that played a huge role in that it actually was established this time, because people knew that such proposal existed. But this came from the island nations 30 years ago, because they knew that they would be losing their country if nothing was done. And they knew that they would need this fund established. And it has not come from countries that bear the responsibility of the climate crisis. And I'm just reflecting over what you both have said, but I always ask myself, and this was a debate kind of in the climate space a few years ago, what does carbon neutral mean? So how many people know what carbon neutral means in this room? Put up your hand. Okay. But how many people know what nature positive means? And those are two words that actually are really, really important. I also earlier this year attended the Global Biodiversity Summit in Montreal, and with the Global Biodiversity Youth Network. And why I'm mentioning this is because there's normally huge confusion around what these words mean. For example, for nature positive, there is actually no definition for what nature even means.
How do you define that? Because I didn't know the concept that well that I would have, raised my hand. So
yeah, well, because there is no definition. So nature, no, there is, and this is something that is being negotiated between the parties, right? Or that parties are pushing for example. So nature, for example, can be a piece of grass as it can be a 1,000-year-old rainforest. And so again, these are these clever calculations that I'm talking about, where people are saying, but it's nature positive, everything is fine, right? But it's not fine, because a piece of grass is not the same thing as a rainforest that is an amazing carbon sink. And carbon neutral, I think that is a word that is also used a lot by companies, huge emitting companies, that this term, this word, actually plays in favor of these companies, because why would they not? That's why they keep using it, and we really need to kind of like challenge these kinds of expressions, because carbon neutral can be that you're offsetting, for example, and then suddenly everything is fine, but it's not, because we're still emitting. So really just like question this terminology and think, what does it actually mean, and why are we even using it? Because now when we mention these words, we think that everything is okay, but it's actually not.
Thank you, Helena, for challenging us. And now I think we have time for questions from the audience, if you would have any. Yes, we have here and then there. It should be.
Now it's yes. On.
Yes. Perfect.
Yeah, hi. My name is Benjamin Pitkänen, and I am a vegan activist, and maybe related to the eco crisis and biodiversity loss. It would be lovely to hear from many perspectives what you think about the role of animal agriculture and the increasing amount of animal agriculture and the connection to the eco crisis, and maybe you can answer about this cap, the European level, and you can the Finnish level. But how do you think that we should tackle like the consumption of animals, because it is like one of the leading reasons for Amazon logging or the rainforest destruction? And of course, if we won't fix the animal agriculture and stop and shift to a plant-based food system, we can't like solve the eco crisis. So how would you promote this thing, and are you willing to promote like shifting towards a plant-based world with your own work? Because I think it's really vital if you want to still have a planet where we can live.
Thank you, Benjamin. Maybe we can start with Mai.
Yeah, well, I think it's not only my own opinion, it's only from the IPPES, the International Nature Panel, and the UNFCCC, the Climate Panel, which are saying that we basically have to change our current mode of agriculture, and we have to shift away from this animal-intensive farming if we want to even try to act in the face of the climate crisis and biodiversity loss. So it's not an opinion, in my opinion, that that is something that we can't combine the current mode and trying to solve this global crisis. So that's why I feel that we should just like face this reality and admit that, hey, we have to change our current agricultural mode. And of course, in Finland, we are very much tied to the EU agricultural policy, which maybe Tytti can comment on. But nationally, I think we should take this national target that, hey, okay, we want to decrease the animal farming and take like yearly targets and percentages that that we have some kind of like road map how we go there, and really try to like shift the big norm into more how do I say non-animal based food system. And so I think like now there would be a governmental negotiation where they could do this, but I'm not very optimistic. And at the moment, we are of course saying that we have to promote people eating more vegetarian food and stuff, but it's still so small compared to the big picture. Yeah, maybe you want to come.
I think our minister has to leave soon, so maybe you can answer next. Yeah.
It's not just a rumor that ministers have a very busy schedule. I'm sorry, but thank you for your excellent question. And also, I think in this issue, particularly, a huge change of paradigm has been happening already for quite some time. Also, at the very personal level, we have 4 children, me and my husband, and 2 of them are vegans. So quite an improvement. And I believe that also at the political level, the awareness has been, growing already for a long time. But still, a lot needs to be done. And in the EU Common Agricultural Policy, it is something that is entirely EU's policy, EU-regulated policy. For this current period, we have negotiated ever more obligations when it comes to climate-friendly production and animal well-being. There are 2 pillars in the European Union CAP policy, Common Agricultural Policy. The first one is the direct income transfers to the farmers, and the second pillar is the so-called rural development. And usually, before this current ongoing period, the binding obligations were only in the second pillar, only in the money that is, directed, allocated to the rural development. Now, during this current period, also in the direct payments to the farmers, you need to obey to some environmental regulation, animal welfare, and climate protection. I know it's not enough for my and for many, but what I've learned in politics that you have to be patient yet determined and change things for the better. I believe that the next period, 2027 and on, will be even more ambitious, and at least I hope that we in Finland could be, promoting these targets.
Thank you.
Well, in Ecuador, we don't have as much as there is in Brazil, but this is an immense issue. And I honestly think that, morally and in every single way, what the best thing to do is just ban it. Like, ban the entire thing. Like, don't let meat from Brazil come here, because it's caused, it's hundreds of indigenous people have been murdered. So much rainforest has been cut down for it. And it's just time to ban it, because it's being exported to all around the world, but if no one wants it, then how are they going to continue doing it? But in more to going into veganism, I think that's if that's a choice you want to make, that's really good. And I always say that as soon as I leave my community or the kind of the closest area to it, I become a vegetarian. because outside I actually don't know where the meat is sourced from, so I just prefer not to eat it because I really want to know where the thing that I'm eating is coming from. And I think that we've kind of been like disconnected to the sources of our food, of where like our clothes come from, where like everything we use come from. We have actually no idea where anything of this is where this is coming from. So I think I've always set that rule for myself, that I want to know where this was produced. I want to know what this animal was eating. I mean, of course, in our culture, we do eat meat, and that is up to every single person's decision to make if they want to do that or not. But for me personally, I just really want to know if this is something that I feel okay with eating. And when it comes to what I said earlier, I think it's banned, the entire thing. I mean, why should we keep importing meat from Brazil when we know the devastating effects of it?
Thank you, Helena. Thank you. Yes.
More clever women to answer your question.
Thank you.
Have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Then we had the next question over there.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank all the speakers, and wondered, one thing that always grinds my gears is people using language like this is a watershed moment for the climate movement, because I'm 34 now, and every single year that I've been in any way politically involved has been a watershed moment, and it's been really important to make gains. And against that backdrop, I'm always kind of baffled by how people tend to think that this sort of cynicism toward a rules-based worldview on the part of many communities and countries happen in a vacuum. I mean, maybe the cynicism is because our rules-based world has yielded very little for these people. It's doing nothing for them. So I guess what I'd like to ask is, how do we bring more people on board in a way that is actually sustainable and makes a difference, so that we wouldn't have to use these this fancy, flowery language to describe what are ultimately very small gains?
Thank you. That's an excellent point, and it brings us to the role of the role of the civil society. Yes.
Should I start? Well, I think that there is always momentum to do something. And I remember that, like, in 2019, was it, when Greta started striking, there was a huge global momentum of talking about the climate crisis. And I remember, like, all the young people that had already been working in climate being like, how to maintain this momentum? We don't want to let it go, because we really want people to keep talking about climate. And we have. And we have kept talking about climate. It's definitely not where it was a few years ago. There's happened a lot in the world. For example, the war here the attack of Russia in Ukraine. And so the momentum has shifted to other conversations. But I think there's always momentum if you create it. But to your question of how we get more people engaged, I feel like there's never only one solution to a problem. There are many, many, and there needs to be different angles to every single problem. And I honestly do think that young people have played a huge role in the past few years in changing a narrative and inserting certain things into conversations. And it's, I mean, they always say that, oh, you're so inspiring, you give us so much hope, and so on. And it's no, but we actually we insert things into a conversation. And we insert the most important parts that are being forgotten or that are being ignored to a conversation. And I think that's really, really something that young people all over the world are doing in a really good way. And I guess some strategies that we have used has been just mixing a lot of things with climate communication, for example. We've used pop culture, we've used arts, we've used so many things, which makes the climate thing a little bit more tangible for people. And I think that is what's really hard about it. It's really hard to comprehend. It doesn't feel very tangible, and people often feel very, very disconnected to what that means. And I think finding the different ways of communicating it to people is kind of our best chances of getting more and more people interested in it and then get involved.
Thank you, Helena. Mai, do you have something to add?
Well, I don't know. It was a really good answer. And maybe if I reflect my own history, like I was 9 years old when I wanted to join the environmental movement, and I didn't know like anyone who were interested in environmental activism, and I was just like when I look what is happening now, I feel that whoa, like there's so much of this kind of like movement and words to describe for example, the feelings and all this thing what I didn't have when I was young. So for me, it looks that things are really things has changed for better. But of course, we are facing such a huge challenges that it's always like you always still feel that it's not enough, and we would need to be already much further than we are. But I think one point which when this has been studied is said that if a person feels some kind of like participation on the issue, then he or she also like accepts it's better. Like for example, if you are talking about environmental crises only on a very macro level, it's like you said, it's very hard to create this personal attachment. But if you have examples from like local communities that they are seeing that, okay, now we have this kind of like, let's say, climate work or restoration work or whatever there, and that you are the actors, you local people here, you are now actually the ones who are doing the work, which is like the solution and not the problem. And then people feel that, okay, this is something, I feel that the narrative is not that I'm the problem, it's against me, but they feel that, oh, I'm part of this, and then they accept it much easier and feel that this is something what they want to do and what to see in their communities. So I think, for example, that we should somehow be better, for example, in Finland, to articulate that how this work, what we need to do, is something that is relevant to the smaller communities. It's easy in Helsinki to say that, okay, hey, people are very pro environmentalism, but if you go outside, it's already much harder because it doesn't maybe, the narrative is not local, and that we should be better.
Good point. We would still have time for one question if somebody has. There's one hand up.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for inspiring keynotes and really interesting discussion. My name is Katri Vihma. I'm from the University of Helsinki. I'm currently doing research on the rights of nature, so a lot with what you, Helena, talked about resonated a lot and found it super interesting. And you underline that we need to have the shift in our mindset in how we relate to natural world or to other than humans. And I would love to hear your thoughts on how that could or should happen in practice. Like, how would you like to see that change happening globally? And of course, maybe how about in the context of Finland? Thank you so much.
Of course. Well, I think that first off, Ecuador is the first country in the world to recognize the rights of nature in its constitution, which I think is a huge reflection of the work of indigenous people. And because the indigenous culture and the indigenous movement is so present in politics in Ecuador, I think that is what really kind of why this is in our constitution now. And I only see it as, I always say that we need to translate kind of indigenous wisdom into a language that the West understands. And so this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about when I say that. I was telling you about the living forest before, about the Kausaksacha, of how we see the forest as a living being. And when I say a living being, I don't mean that it's science. I mean that the science says that it's, you know, like they have all this what are they called, like the all these scientific words for describing a living organism, but it's a living being with a spirit, and that is our belief, and that's how our relationship has been formed with nature. But that is really, really hard to convince people that don't grow up in the rainforest. So we have found ways to translate this, and the rights of nature is an example of that, of how we can get rights for a living being, but speaking another language. We spoke the judicial language in this case. And I think, I mean, of course, like sharing this knowledge and sharing the stories of this is a great way to kind of start that conversation. But I also think that there is kind of some need to, what you were saying actually, locally find some kind of connection to the land. And always when I have kind of these speaking things and people say, oh, like, how can I come to the rainforest and I want to learn about this? And I think to myself, or I say this like, but actually you shouldn't have to come to the rainforest to see this. I mean, you can find forests and amazing lakes here in Finland that are like absolutely like stunning, and learn and just kind of find what this land means to you the way that we have in the rainforest. And I think that is what's really, really needed to kind of like find your own relationship to land. And there's a huge disconnection in what I was talking about before of what our resources or clothes or food and so on come from. There's a huge disconnection of how the human being actually is one that belongs in nature. And it might feel very, very isolated when we're in these big rooms, but we actually are a part of nature, and we've always have been. It's just that at some point in history we forgot it. So yeah, thank you for posing that question.
Would you mind?
Yeah. I actually I work in the environmental committee, and when we were doing the nature protection law, I asked that can somebody get me a memo of from different countries the examples of what are the different legal statuses of nature. And it was really interesting, quite short memo from different countries that have had legal status for nature, or for a river, or for a non-human species like dolphins or so. And from that I see that nowhere it's very far, but there are a lot of examples. And the challenge is that our legal system is so anthropocentric that we have created this massive system that is protecting people, but when done so, we are actually also our own existence is threatened because we have created this division, which is not maybe in the real world, but it's we have created it. But I also think that the legal system is one. For example, we have a initiative that we should have fundamental rights for the animals in order to not see them as just obstacles as they are now. So there are like these initiatives that you can do, and I'm sure that in 20 years we will have different legal system if we have stable societies or so, where we have learned to give higher status to other species than humans, because it's also something what we have to do for our own sake. But like you said, that I think that like when I was working in an environmental organization and we wanted some politicians to protect a forest, we took them there. We took them there and we spent the night there. So they have some personal connection to that forest, that they see that, oh, it's not just a name on the paper, it's a living ecosystem where they have been themselves. So it created a connection. And I also believe that the legal system is one, but we also have to create these personal connections to other species and nature and so on.
And I'll add something very briefly there. Something that I also think when it comes to rights is access to nature. And that is apparently not an obvious thing, right? For a lot of people in the world. A lot of people don't have access to nature, and I think that has contributed to this, because it should be our fundamental right to have access to nature, and that's unfortunately not the case, which has led to this massive disconnection, massive forced disconnection for many people.
And can I also add one sentence? I think it's also a fight in the cities, like in Helsinki, the access and rights to have a lähiluonto, like some green area, some nature left in your suburb or your living area. And that's what we are fighting here also.
Yeah, that's a good point with constant building. Yeah. Unfortunately, we are running out of time now, which is a shame, because I think we could keep you here forever. But I would very much like to thank you for participating and for the great discussion. It was very lovely having you here. Thank you.